Agatha Christie. The Murder in the Vicarage. Part 3 Nas. Chapter 2. Griselda is a very irritating woman. On leaving the luncheon table, I had felt myself to be in a good mood for preparing a really forceful address for the Church of England Men's Society. Now I felt restless and disturbed. Just when I was really settling down to it, Lettuce Prothero drifted in. I use the word drifted advisedly. I have read novels in which young people are described as bursting with energy, joie de vivre, the magnificent vitality of youth. Personally, all the young people I come across have the air of animal wraiths. Lettuce was particularly wraith-like this afternoon. She is a pretty girl, very tall and fair and completely vague. She drifted through the French window, absently pulled off the yellow beret she was wearing and murmured vaguely with a kind of far-away surprise, "Oh. It's you." There is a path from Old Hall through the woods which comes out by our garden gate, so that most people coming from the come in at that gate and up to the study window instead of going a long way round by the road and coming to the front door. I was not surprised at Lettuce coming in this way, but I did a little resent her attitude. If you come to a vicarage, you ought to be prepared to find a vicar. She came in and collapsed in a crumpled heap in one of my big armchairs. She plucked aimlessly at her hair, staring at the ceiling. "Is Dennis anywhere about?" "I haven't seen him since lunch. I understood he was going to play tennis at your place." "Oh," said Lettuce. "I hope he isn't. He won't find anybody there." "He said you asked him." "I believe I did. Only that was Friday. And today's Tuesday." "It's Wednesday," I said. "Oh, how dreadful," said Lettuce. "That means that I've forgotten to go to lunch with some people for the third time." Fortunately it didn't seem to worry her much. "Is Griselda anywhere about?" "I expect you'll find her in the studio in the garden, sitting to Lawrence Reading." "There's been quite a sheemal about him," said Lettuce. "With father, you know. Father's dreadful." "What was the she, whatever it was about?" I inquired. "About his painting me. Father found out about it. Why shouldn't I be painted in my bathing dress? If I go on a beach in it, why shouldn't I be painted in it?" Lettuce paused and then went on. "It's really absurd, father forbidding a young man the house. Of course, Lawrence and I simply shriek about it. I shall come and be done here in your studio." "No, my dear," I said. "Not if your father forbids it." "Oh, dear," said Lettuce, sighing. "How tiresome everyone is. I feel shattered. Definitely. If only I had some money I'd go away. But without it I can't. If only father would be decent and die, I should be all right." "You must not say things like that, Lettuce." "Well, if he doesn't want me to want him to die, he shouldn't be so horrible over money. I don't wonder mother left him. Do you know, for years I believed she was dead. What sort of a young man did she run away with? Was he nice?" "It was before your father came to live here." "I wonder what's become of her. I expect Anne will have an affair with someone soon. Anne hates me. She's quite decent to me, but she hates me. She's getting old and she doesn't like it. That's the age you break out, you know." I wondered if Lettuce was going to spend the entire afternoon in my study. "You haven't seen my gramophone records, have you?" she asked. "No." "How tiresome. I know I've left them somewhere. And I've lost the dog. And my wristwatch is somewhere, only it doesn't much matter because it won't go. Oh, dear, I am so sleepy. I can't think why, because I didn't get up till 11. But life's very shattering, don't you think? Oh, dear, I must go. I'm going to see Dr. Stone's Barrow at 3 o'clock. I glanced at the clock and remarked that it was now 5:20 to 4. "Oh. Is it? How dreadful. I wonder if they've waited or if they've gone without me. I suppose I'd better go down and do something about it." She got up and drifted out again, murmuring over her shoulder, You'll tell Dennis, won't you? I said yes mechanically, only realizing too late that I had no idea what it was I was to tell Dennis. But I reflected that in all probability it did not matter. I fell to cogitating on the subject of Dr. Stone, a well-known archaeologist who had recently come to stay at the Blue Boar, whilst he superintended the excavation of a barrow situated on Colonel Prothero's property. There had already been several disputes between him and the colonel. I was amused at his appointment to take Lettice to see the operations. It occurred to me that Lettice Prothero was something of a minx. I wondered how she would get on with the archaeologist's secretary, Miss Cram. Miss Cram is a healthy young woman of 25, noisy in manner, with a high color, fine animal spirits and a mouth that always seems to have more than its full share of teeth. Village opinion is divided as to whether she is no better than she should be, or else a young woman of iron virtue who purposes to become Mrs. Stone at an early opportunity. She is in every way a great contrast to Lettice. I could imagine that the state of things at Old Hall might not be too happy. Colonel Prothero had married again some 5 years previously. The second Mrs. Prothero was a remarkably handsome woman in a rather unusual style. I had always guessed that the relations between her and her stepdaughter were not too happy. I had one more interruption. This time, it was my curate, Hawes. He wanted to know the details of my interview with Prothero. I told him that the colonel had deplored his Romish tendencies but that the real purpose of his visit had been on quite another matter. At the same time, I entered a protest of my own, and told him plainly that he must conform to my ruling. On the whole, he took my remarks very well. I felt rather remorseful when he had gone for not liking him better. These irrational likes and dislikes that one takes to people are, I am sure, very unchristian. With a sigh, I realized that the hands of the clock on my writing table pointed to 5:15, a sign that it was really 4:30, and I made my way to the drawing room. 4 of my parishioners were assembled there with teacups. Griselda sat behind the tea table trying to look natural in her environment, but only succeeded in looking more out of place than usual. I shook hands all round and sat down between Miss Marple and Miss Weatherby. Miss Marple is a white-haired old lady with a gentle, appealing manner. Miss Weatherby is a mixture of vinegar and gush. Of the two, Miss Marple is much the more dangerous. "We were just talking," said Griselda in a honey-sweet voice, "about Dr. Stone and Miss Cram." A ribald rhyme concocted by Dennis shot through my head. "Miss Cram doesn't give a damn." I had a sudden yearning to say it out loud and observe the effect, but fortunately I refrained. Miss Weatherby said tersely, "No nice girl would do it," and shut her thin lips disapprovingly. "Do what?" I inquired. "Be a secretary to an unmarried man," said Miss Weatherby in a horrified tone. "Oh, my dear," said Miss Marple. "I think married ones are the worst. Remember poor Molly Carter. Married men living apart from their wives are, of course, notorious," said Miss Weatherby. "And even some of the ones living with their wives," murmured Miss Marple. "I remember." I interrupted these unsavory reminiscences. "But surely," I said, "in these days a girl can take a post in just the same way as a man does." "To come away to the country? And stay at the same hotel?" said Mrs. Price Ridley in a severe voice. Miss Weatherby murmured to Miss Marple in a low voice. "And all the bedrooms on the same floor?" Miss Hartnell, who is weather-beaten and jolly and much dreaded by the poor, observed in a loud, hearty voice. "The poor man will be caught before he knows where he is. He's as innocent as a babe unborn, you can see that." Curious what turns of phrase we employ. None of the ladies present would have dreamed of alluding to an actual baby till it was safely in the cradle, visible to all. "Disgusting, I call it," continued Miss Hartnell, with her usual tactlessness. "The man must be at least 25 years older than she is." 3 female voices rose at once, making disconnected remarks about the choir boys' outing, the regrettable incident at the last mothers' meeting, and the drafts in the church. Miss Marple twinkled at Griselda. "Don't you think," said my wife, "that Miss Grand may just like having an interesting job? And that she considers Dr. Stone just as an employer?" There was a silence. Evidently none of the 4 ladies agreed. Miss Marple broke the silence by patting Griselda on the arm. "My dear," she said, "you are very young. The young have such innocent minds." Griselda said indignantly that she hadn't got at all an innocent mind. "Naturally," said Miss Marple, unheeding of the protest, "you think the best of everyone." "Do you really think she wants to marry that bald-headed dull man?" "I understand he is quite well off," said Miss Marple. "Rather a violent temper, I'm afraid. He had quite a serious quarrel with Colonel Prothero the other day." Everyone leaned forward interestingly. Colonel Prothero accused him of being an ignoramus. "How like Colonel Prothero, and how absurd," said Mrs. Price Ridley. "Very like Colonel Prothero, but I don't know about it being absurd," said Miss Marple. "You remember the woman who came down here and said she represented welfare, and after taking subscriptions she was never heard of again and proved to having nothing whatever to do with welfare. One is so inclined to be trusting and take people at their own valuation." "I should never have dreamed of describing Miss Marple as trusting." "There's been some fuss about that young artist, Mr. Redding, hasn't there?" asked Miss Weatherby. Miss Marple nodded. "Colonel Prothero turned him out of the house. It appears he was painting lettuce in her bathing dress." "I always thought there was something between them," said Mrs. Price Ridley. "That young fellow is always mouching off up there. Pity the girl hasn't got a mother. A stepmother is never the same thing." "I dare say Mrs. Prothero does her best," said Miss Hartnell. "Girls are so sly," deplored Mrs. Price Ridley. "Quite a romance, isn't it?" said the softer-hearted Miss Weatherby. "He's a very good-looking young fellow." "But loose," said Miss Hartnell. "Bound to be. An artist. Paris. Models. The altogether." "Painting her in her bathing dress," said Mrs. Price Ridley. "Not quite nice." "He's painting me too," said Griselda. "But not in your bathing dress, dear," said Miss Marple. "It might be worse," said Griselda solemnly. "Naughty girl," said Miss Hartnell, taking the joke broad-mindedly. Everybody else looked slightly shocked. "Did dear Lettice tell you of the trouble?" asked Miss Marple of me. "Tell me?" "Yes. I saw her pass through the garden and go round to the study window." Miss Marple always sees everything. Gardening is as good as a smoke-screen, and the habit of observing birds through powerful glasses can always be turned to account. "She mentioned it, yes," I admitted. "Mr. Hawes looked worried," said Miss Marple. "I hope he hasn't been working too hard." "Oh!" cried Miss Weatherby excitedly. "I quite forgot. I knew I had some news for you. I saw Dr. Haydock coming out of Mrs. Lestrange's cottage." Everyone looked at each other. "Perhaps she's ill," suggested Mrs. Price Ridley. "It must have been very sudden, if so," said Miss Hartnell. "For I saw her walking round her garden at 3 o'clock this afternoon, and she seemed in perfect health." "She and Dr. Haydock must be old acquaintances," said Mrs. Price Ridley. "He's been very quiet about it." "It's curious," said Miss Weatherby, "that he's never mentioned it." "As a matter of fact," said Griselda in a low, mysterious voice, and stopped. Everyone leaned forward excitedly. "I happen to know," said Griselda impressively. "Her husband was a missionary. Terrible story. He was eaten, you know. Actually eaten. And she was forced to become the chief's head wife. Dr. Haydock was with an expedition and rescued her." For a moment excitement was rife, then Miss Marple said reproachfully, but with a smile, "Naughty girl." She tapped Griselda approvingly on the arm. Very unwise thing to do, my dear. If you make up these things, people are quite likely to believe them. And sometimes that leads to complications. A distinct frost had come over the assembly. Two of the ladies rose to take their departure. I wonder if there is anything between young Lawrence Redding and Lettice Prothero, said Miss Weatherby. It certainly looks like it. What do you think, Miss Marple? Miss Marple seemed thoughtful. I shouldn't have said so myself. Not Lettice. Quite another person I should have said. But Colonel Prothero must have thought. He has always struck me as rather a stupid man, said Miss Marple. The kind of man who gets the wrong idea into his head and is obstinate about it. Do you remember Joe Bucknell, who used to keep the Blue Boar? Such a to-do about his daughter carrying on with young Bailey. And all the time it was that minx of a wife of his. She was looking full at Griselda as she spoke, and I suddenly felt a wild surge of anger. Don't you think, Miss Marple, I said, that we're all inclined to let our tongues run away with us too much? Charity thinketh no evil, you know. Inestimable harm may be done by foolish wagging of tongues in ill-natured gossip. Dear Vicar, said Miss Marple, you are so unworldly. I'm afraid that observing human nature for as long as I have done, one gets not to expect very much from it. I dare say the idle tittle-tattle is very wrong and unkind, but it is so often true.
Agatha Christie. The Murder in the Vicarage. Part 3. Nasty old cat, said Griselda, as soon as the door was closed. She made a face in the direction of the departing visitors and then looked at me and laughed. Len, do you really suspect me of having an affair with Lawrence Redding? My dear, of course not. But you thought Miss Marple was hinting at it. And you rose to my defense simply beautifully. Like an angry tiger. A momentary uneasiness assailed me. A clergyman of the Church of England ought never to put himself in the position of being described as an angry tiger. I felt the occasion could not pass without a protest. I said. But Griselda, I wish you would be a little more careful in what you say. Do you mean the cannibal story? She asked. Or the suggestion that Lawrence was painting me in the nude? If they only knew that he was painting me in a thick cloak with a very high fur collar, the sort of thing that you could go quite purely to see the Pope in, not a bit of sinful flesh showing anywhere. In fact, it's all marvelously pure. Lawrence never even attempts to make love to me, I can't think why. Surely knowing that you're a married woman. Don't pretend to come out of the ark, Len. You know very well that an attractive young woman with an elderly husband is a kind of gift from heaven to a young man. There must be some other reason, it's not that I'm unattractive, I'm not. Surely you don't want him to make love to you? No, said Griselda, with more hesitation than I thought becoming. If he's in love with Lettice Prothero. Miss Marple didn't seem to think he was. Miss Marple may be mistaken. She never is. That kind of old cat is always right. She paused a minute and then said, with a quick sidelong glance at me, you do believe me, don't you? I mean, that there's nothing between Lawrence and me. My dear Griselda, I said, surprised. Of course. My wife came across and kissed me. I wish you weren't so terribly easy to deceive, Len. You'd believe me whatever I said. I should hope so. But, my dear, I do beg of you to guard your tongue and be careful of what you say. These women are singularly deficient in humor, remember, and take everything seriously. What they need, said Griselda, is a little immorality in their lives. Then they wouldn't be so busy looking for it in other people's. And on this she left the room, and glancing at my watch I hurried out to pay some visits that ought to have been made earlier in the day. The Wednesday evening service was sparsely attended as usual, but when I came out through the church, after disrobing in the vestry, it was empty save for a woman who stood staring up at one of our windows. We have some rather fine old stained glass, and indeed the church itself is well worth looking at. She turned at my footsteps, and I saw that it was Mrs. Lestrange. We both hesitated a moment, and then I said, "I hope you like our little church." "I've been admiring the screen," she said. Her voice was pleasant, low, yet very distinct, with a clear-cut enunciation. She added, "I'm so sorry to have missed your wife yesterday." We talked a few minutes longer about the church. She was evidently a cultured woman who knew something of church history and architecture. We left the building together and walked down the road, since one way to the vicarage led past her house. As we arrived at the gate, she said pleasantly, "Come in, won't you? And tell me what you think of what I have done." I accepted the invitation. Little Gates had formerly belonged to an Anglo-Indian colonel, and I could not help feeling relieved by the disappearance of the brass tables and Burmese idols. It was furnished now very simply, but in exquisite taste. There was a sense of harmony and rest about it. Yet I wondered more and more what had brought such a woman as Mrs. Lestrange to St. Mary Mead. She was so very clearly a woman of the world that it seemed a strange taste to bury herself in a country village. In the clear light of her drawing room I had an opportunity of observing her closely for the first time. She was a very tall woman. Her hair was gold with a tinge of red in it. Her eyebrows and eyelashes were dark, whether by art or by nature I could not decide. If she was, as I thought, made up, it was done very artistically. There was something sphinx-like about her face when it was in repose, and she had the most curious eyes I have ever seen. They were almost golden in shade. Her clothes were perfect and she had all the ease of manner of a well-bred woman, and yet there was something about her that was incongruous and baffling. You felt that she was a mystery. The word Griselda had used occurred to me, sinister. Absurd, of course, and yet, was it so absurd? The thought sprang unbidden into my mind, this woman would stick at nothing. Our talk was on most normal lines, pictures, books, old churches. Yet somehow I got very strongly the impression that there was something else, something of quite a different nature that Mrs. Lestrange wanted to say to me. I caught her eye on me once or twice, looking at me with a curious hesitancy, as though she were unable to make up her mind. She kept the talk, I noticed, strictly to impersonal subjects. She made no mention of a husband or relations. But all the time there was that strange urgent appeal in her glance. It seemed to say, "Shall I tell you? I want to. Can't you help me?" Yet in the end it died away, or perhaps it had all been my fancy. I had the feeling that I was being dismissed. I rose and took my leave. As I went out of the room, I glanced back and saw her staring after me with a puzzled, doubtful expression. On an impulse I came back. "If there is anything I can do," she said doubtfully, "it's very kind of you." We were both silent. Then she said, "I wish I knew. It's difficult. No, I don't think anyone can help me. But thank you for offering to do so." That seemed final, so I went. But as I did so, I wondered. We are not used to mysteries in St. Mary Mead. So much is this the case that as I emerged from the gate I was pounced upon. Miss Hartnell is very good at pouncing in a heavy and cumbrous way. "I saw you," she exclaimed with ponderous humor. "And I was so excited. Now you can tell us all about it." "About what?" "The mysterious lady. Is she a widow or has she a husband somewhere?" "I really couldn't say. She didn't tell me." "How very peculiar. One would think she would be certain to mention something casually. It almost looks, doesn't it, as though she had a reason for not speaking?" "I really don't see that." "Ah. But as dear Miss Marple says, you are so unworldly, dear Vicar. Tell me, has she known Dr. Haydock long?" "She didn't mention him, so I don't know." "Really? But what did you talk about then?" "Pictures, music, books," I said truthfully. Miss Hartnell, whose only topics of conversation are the purely personal, looked suspicious and unbelieving. Taking advantage of a momentary hesitation on her part as to how to proceed next, I bade her good night and walked rapidly away. I called in at a house farther down the village and returned to the vicarage by the garden gate, passing, as I did so, the danger point of Miss Marple's garden. However, I did not see how it was humanly possible for the news of my visit to Mrs. Lestrange to have yet reached her ears, so I felt reasonably safe. As I latched the gate, it occurred to me that I would just step down to the shed in the garden which young Lawrence Reading was using as a studio, and see for myself how Griselda's portrait was progressing. I append a rough sketch here which will be useful in the light of after happenings, only sketching in such details as are necessary. I had no idea there was anyone in the studio. There had been no voices from within to warn me, and I suppose that my own footsteps made no noise upon the grass. I opened the door and then stopped awkwardly on the threshold, for there were two people in the studio, and the man's arms were round the woman and he was kissing her passionately. The two people were the artist, Lawrence Reading, and Mrs. Prothero. I backed out precipitately and beat a retreat to my study. There I sat down in a chair, took out my pipe, and thought things over. The discovery had come as a great shock to me. Especially since my conversation with Lettice that afternoon, I had felt fairly certain that there was some kind of understanding growing up between her and the young man. Moreover, I was convinced that she herself thought so. I felt positive that she had no idea of the artist's feelings for her stepmother. A nasty tangle. I paid a grudging tribute to Miss Marple. She had not been deceived but had evidently suspected the true state of things with a fair amount of accuracy. I had entirely misread her meaning glance at Griselda. I had never dreamt of considering Mrs. Prothero in the matter. There has always been rather a suggestion of Caesar's wife about Mrs. Prothero, a quiet, self-contained woman whom one would not suspect of any great depths of feeling. I had got to this point in my meditations when a tap on my study window aroused me. I got up and went to it. Mrs. Prothero was standing outside. I opened the window and she came in, not waiting for an invitation on my part. She crossed the room in a breathless sort of way and dropped down on the sofa. I had the feeling that I had never really seen her before. The quiet self-contained woman that I knew had vanished. In her place was a quick-breathing, desperate creature. For the first time I realized that Anne Prothero was beautiful. She was a brown-haired woman with a pale face and very deep-set grey eyes. She was flushed now and her breast heaved. It was as though a statue had suddenly come to life. I blinked my eyes at the transformation. "I thought it best to come," she said. You saw just now?" I bowed my head. She said very quietly, "We love each other." And even in the middle of her evident distress and agitation she could not keep a little smile from her lips, the smile of a woman who sees something very beautiful and wonderful. I still said nothing, and she added presently, "I suppose to you that seems very wrong? Can you expect me to say anything else, Mrs. Prothero? Image." I still said nothing, and she added presently, "I suppose to you that seems very wrong? Can you expect me to say anything else, Mrs. Prothero?" No, I suppose not." I went on, trying to make my voice as gentle as possible. "You are a married woman." She interrupted me. "Oh. I know. Do you think I haven't gone over all that again and again? I'm not a bad woman really, I'm not. And things aren't, as you might think they are." I said gravely, "I'm glad of that." She asked rather timorously, "Are you going to tell my husband?" I said rather dryly, "There seems to be a general idea that a clergyman is incapable of behaving like a gentleman. That is not true." She threw me a grateful glance. "I'm so unhappy. Oh. I'm so dreadfully unhappy. I can't go on. I simply can't go on. And I don't know what to do." Her voice rose with a slightly hysterical note in it. You don't know what my life is like. I've been miserable with Lucius from the beginning. No woman could be happy with him. I wish he were dead. It's awful, but I do. I'm desperate. I tell you, I'm desperate. She started and looked over at the window. What was that? I thought I heard someone. Perhaps it's Lawrence. I went over to the window which I had not closed as I had thought. I stepped out and looked down the garden, but there was no one in sight. Yet I was almost convinced that I, too, had heard someone. Or perhaps it was her certainty that had convinced me. When I re-entered the room she was leaning forward, drooping her head down. She looked the picture of despair. She said again, "I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do." I came and sat down beside her. I said the things I thought it was my duty to say, and tried to say them with the necessary conviction, uneasily conscious all the time that that same morning I had given voice to the sentiment that a world without Colonel Prothero in it would be improved for the better. Above all, I begged her to do nothing rash. To leave her home and her husband was a very serious step. I don't suppose I convinced her. I have lived long enough in the world to know that arguing with anyone in love is next door to useless, but I do think my words brought to her some measure of comfort. When she rose to go, she thanked me, and promised to think over what I had said. Nevertheless, when she had gone, I felt very uneasy. I felt that hitherto I had misjudged Anne Prothero's character. She impressed me now as a very desperate woman, the kind of woman who would stick at nothing once her emotions were aroused. And she was desperately, wildly, madly in love with Lawrence Redding, a man several years younger than herself. I didn't like it. No, I suppose not.
Isn't it? That last Parthian shot went home.